Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to my January wrap-up. I read 8 things in the month of January, and today I'm going to be telling you about those books. So as usual, I'm going to start off with the classics I read this month. I've just finished Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This is a 19th century Victorian sensationalist novel about many things. It's quite dramatic and quite exciting and reminds me in many ways of Wilkie Collins. I've been buddy reading this with Caroline from BBC Girl. Basically, Lady Audley's Secret was not what I expected. I had an idea in my head of what it was about and realised when I was reading it that I had been mistaken in that idea, which was quite nice because I thought I was spoiled for the mystery, for the secret, but actually I wasn't. Michael Audley has been a widower for many years. He has a daughter of about 18, and then he marries again, a second wife who is only apparently about 20 years old, and who no one really knows much about her life. She was a governess for the doctor's family in the village, but before that, nobody really knows where she came from. So Michael Audley also has a nephew, Robert Audley. Robert Audley is in many ways a barrister. He is qualified as a barrister, but he doesn't actually do any work, and he basically spends his time smoking pipes and drinking French novels. He is a glorious character. I really enjoyed him. Fairly near the beginning of the book, Robert Audley goes to visit his uncle along with his friend George Talboy, who has just come back from 3 years away in Australia, and then George Talboy goes missing and everything kind of goes on from there. I especially love the character of Robert Audley, and what I especially love, the thing that made this book really wonderful and enjoyable and fascinating for me, is the relationship that Robert has with George, because it's really romantic. Like, I think it would be really hard as a reader nowadays, probably not in the Victorian period, but as a reader nowadays, it's really hard to read it without thinking that Robert is slightly in love with George. And then later on in the book, Robert meets George's sister, and so there's this really interesting non-fiction book called Queer Dickens by a woman called Holly Fernu, who is writing about the way that you can see kind of LGBT themes and non-heteronormative themes in Dickens and in other 19th century novels. And she talks about this massive trend, which you can see in a lot of 19th century novels, of men who marry their best friends' sisters. Like, they marry the sisters of their male best friends, even though they have a kind of like semi-romantic relationship with their male best friend, and then they marry their sisters. Like, it's the kind of thing you see in Brideshead Revisited very explicitly, but actually it happens in a lot of Victorian literature, like a lot of Victorian literature. And it's quite interesting when you look at it that way, especially because in Lady Audley's Secret, when Robert meets George's sister, like throughout the book, constantly there is all of this, Clara looked so much like George. She was so beautiful, like over and over again. It's interesting, my Victorian novel series that I've got coming up, which I was speaking about last week and had an announcement video for, I had a plan of like all the themes I wanted to talk about, and then the more Victorian literature I read, the more I keep on thinking of different themes, and I think at some point I'll probably add on, and near the end of the series I will do a video about like LGBT themes or kind of same-sex relationships in Victorian literature, because there isn't much that's explicit, but there's actually a lot that is like under the surface, which you can definitely read certain things into. Anyway, that's a tangent. Back to actually Lady Audley's Secret. There were many things I liked about it. Like I said, I really enjoyed the character of Robert Audley. I loved the writing. The writing was so easy to read, so smooth, so enjoyable. Up until like the last quarter, it would have definitely been a 5-star read. The ending made me like it less as a book. It made me love it less, but it made me also want to study it more, because I think there's a lot of really interesting things going on at the end and going on with Lady Audley's Secret. Like, there's a lot that's really fascinating. I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads in the end. Like, I still really enjoyed it. I still think it's a brilliant book and one I'd highly recommend, but I liked the ending less than I thought I would, if that makes sense. But definitely one worth reading, because yes, Lady Audley's Secret was great. I discovered that Mary Elizabeth Braddon has written like nearly 40 other novels, so got lots to keep me busy. Sticking with the classics, I also read this, which is Charles Dickens on Theatre, with a foreword by Sir Richard Eyre, but basically it's by Charles Dickens. It's basically an anthology of Dickens's writings about the theatre during the Victorian times, some non-fiction, some fiction, and just a variety of things. In many ways, I really enjoyed this. Like, I loved reading Dickens talk about the theatre, and it was really, really interesting, and especially when I was making my How to Speak Victorian video back in earlier on in January about drama and theatre within the Victorian period, this was really useful. The only issue I had with this, though, which did really annoy me, is that it doesn't say where any of the extracts are from. Like, it doesn't say whether they're from a novel or whether they were from a newspaper or whether they're like a speech or whether they're from like The Uncommercial Traveller or some of Dickens' longer non-fiction stuff, and it doesn't ever say what year they're from. When they were novels, I knew what novels they were from because I've read all of Dickens' novels, but when they were non-fiction things or short stories, I didn't know where they were from, and I didn't know like what year they were from, which that really annoyed me. I feel like that's a really, really weird choice when you're putting together an anthology of a writer's work. Like, when it's extracts from longer things, surely you would put where they're from, so that was a bit weird. But apart from that, I really enjoyed this, and it was, yeah, interesting to read some more Dickens non-fiction. I really need to read some more. On to the contemporary novels I read this month. I read on audiobook, or I finished on audiobook I should say, because I started it back in December, Imperium by Robert Harris, which I absolutely loved. This is definitely a contender for my favourite book of the month, although that does go to Marina McDonald's Smoked Meat, which I'll be talking about later. But Imperium is absolutely brilliant and something I really, really enjoyed, and possibly more than I was expecting it to. It is a historical novel set in ancient Rome and focuses around the character of Cicero. Cicero was a real man, but this is a fictionalised version of his life, taking what we do actually know about his life and filling in the blanks with various exciting things. I've heard it described as like the West Wing in ancient Rome, and it is quite like that. It's full of political intrigue and drama and is very much about how politics operated in ancient Rome and was fascinating. I read Mary Beard's SBQR last year, which I really enjoyed, and it was really interesting to learn a bit more about ancient Rome. It was really, really interesting to discover a lot more about how Rome worked as a society. Like, you can tell that Robert Harris knows exactly what he's talking about and has researched this massively, and it's just such a joy to read as well, like so interesting and engaging. And I love the way that Cicero's character is done, because he doesn't always make decisions that you like, and sometimes he does things to kind of gain power, which are slightly morally dubious, but he's such an engaging, kind of charming character in many ways that you always feel that he could do better, so it's not like you're angry or you don't like him as a person, you're just like disappointed because he's letting himself down, and it's done so well. I also love that the whole book is narrated from the perspective of Tyro, who is his slave, or was his slave, and his secretary as well. Tyro is, again, a natural historical figure, and he is a wonderful character as well, and I really like that we see Cicero from this outside perspective, a man who has a very interesting relationship with Cicero, because Tyro is his slave, but he's also his friend, but he's also his slave, and it's just really well done. I love the way that their relationship works, and I think Tyro is a wonderful character. He's my favourite. There's just so many brilliant characters, and Robert Harris writes brilliantly and really engagingly. It's so good, and I'm really looking forward to reading the other two in the series. And also, me and Nick just discovered that the theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon are adapting the Robert Harris Cicero trilogy to stage later on in this year, which we're very, very excited about. So yes, this should be good. I also read The Bone Clocks by David Mitchell. I've owned this for quite a while, and I finally got around to reading it. I read Cloud Atlas a fair while ago, 2 years, maybe more, and I absolutely loved it, and I haven't read any David Mitchell since. But I did get around to reading The Bone Clocks this month, and I did enjoy it. I didn't like it as much as Cloud Atlas. I kind of knew I wouldn't, and that's okay, but I still did really enjoy it, and I thought it was really interesting and engagingly written. I find his writing really interesting, and I love the way that he plays with genre. The Bone Clocks, a little bit like Cloud Atlas, is broken up into sections, and the sections have different narrators. But we begin with this character, Holly Sykes, when she's 15, and then in the next section we meet another character who meets Holly Sykes when she's slightly older, and then another character who interacts with Holly at a different point in her life, and I really like how that all operated and the way that we see Holly at different stages of her life. I also enjoyed the kind of magical / possibly science fiction elements going through here. In many ways it kind of reminded me of American Gods. I liked American Gods by Neil Gaiman, but I think American Gods was more about the gods than the characters involved in it, if you see what I mean, whereas The Bone Clocks is less about this dramatic, big battle kind of going on in the background than it is about Holly Sykes. Like, it's really about Holly. I think the one reason I enjoyed this slightly less than Cloud Atlas is the kind of magical elements in here, the kind of magic realism stuff is more important in this book than it is in Cloud Atlas. Like, in Cloud Atlas, it's mostly just science fiction as we go through time, and there is this slight idea that maybe there is a kind of shared soul between various characters, but it's not really what it's about to me. Whereas I think in The Bone Clocks, the magical elements in this is much more important, which doesn't make it any worse. Like, it's still a really good book, but it's slightly less my kind of thing, if you see what I mean, but that's fine. And the other reason was that this book has, I think it's 6 sections, maybe it's 7. I think there are 6 chapters, and the final chapter, the final section, I didn't really see why it was there. I don't know, like, I did enjoy it in many ways, and I think the world that's created in the final chapter, final section, was really effective, but it felt to me like the penultimate section was where the climax happened, and that it could have ended after there and I would have been much happier. I still really enjoyed it, and I would recommend it, and I'm looking forward still to reading more by David Mitchell in the future. I also read this, which is Too Many Magpies by Elizabeth Baines, which is another novel I really enjoyed. I've read a short story collection of Elizabeth Baines before and really enjoyed it. I think she writes in a really interesting, engaging way, and it's a way that makes you feel like you're inside the head of someone who isn't quite thinking straight, but in a really effective way. Too Many Magpies is about a woman who lives in a kind of comfortable but constricting life. She lives with her husband and her 2 young children, and everything's kind of fine in their very comfortable, certain almost respectable middle-class lives, and then she meets a man who has lived a much more like bohemian lifestyle than her and who doesn't obey the rules in the way she does, and she embarks on this affair with him that kind of changes her attitude towards everything else in life. What I really liked about Many Magpies is the fact that actually it's not about how her affair affects her relationship with her husband, it's about how her affair affects her relationship with her children, and I thought that was really interesting and not something I've read that much about before. Like, it has a premise that is used quite a lot, like there's lots of books about affairs, but by making the focus actually on the relationship she has with her children, I think that is very different. It really explores the way that her relationship with them changes because of this affair, and I think that's done very cleverly. Then I also read Skybreaker by Kenneth Opel, which looks like it's absolutely huge, but actually the writing is quite big inside because this is a YA book, or YA? I don't know. It's from 2005, I want to say, 2005? It's from 2005, so it was kind of slightly pre-YA, maybe therefore it's teen fiction instead. But anyway, I read the first one in this series called Airborne at some point in 2016. I really enjoyed it, so it was a real joy to pick up this as well. I love these books. I think they're really fun. Kenneth Opel writes so well, and he explores this kind of steampunk world where people go around in airships, and I think that's great. It's really fun. I also do enjoy the main character, Matt Cruz, and I also like Kate, his friend, who is very, very posh, completely unlike him, who has struggled all his life and never had any money, and she is very posh and very kind of unaware, but also says some hilarious things and is very, very independent for a woman in a kind of Victorian style society. Anyway, I really enjoyed it. It's really good fun and very dramatic, and the writing is very good, and I like the ending as well. I have just discovered that there is a third book in this series, which I'm very excited about, and Nick, who read these when he was a kid and really enjoyed them and recommended them to me, didn't know there was a third one either, so we're going to try and get hold of it. It's out of print in the UK, but apparently it is still in print in Canada, so there we go. I can now get my hands on the third one, which I'm sure I will enjoy as well. I also read a short story collection this month, which was Smoked Meat by Rowena MacDonald. This I absolutely, absolutely loved. It is so, so incredible. I did a full review on this, which I will link down below. It is the first full review I have ever done on my Booktube channel, and I've been on Booktube like a year and a half, so maybe that tells you how good it is. It's just superbly, superbly written. I enjoyed it so much. It is a series of short stories, but more than that, it is a series of interconnected short stories, which are my favourite kind of short stories and just like my favourite kind of book, because they're just brilliant. It's a series of interconnected short stories set in Montreal, and I think the way that the stories link to each other are very, very clever, because there are a lot of characters that you meet in one story and then crop up in another story, but the way they were seen in the first story is very different from the way they were seen in the second story, and so you get a very different perspective on them, and your judgment on them as a person is kind of turned on its head by how you see them in the second story. Like, that is done throughout in a very, very effective way. I already went on about this book and how brilliant it is in my review, but I love that all of the characters, like a lot of the characters, are not very nice people, but they have nice moments, or you see the kind of tenderness between people and real kind of affection and truth and like nice human relationships, even throughout there being a lot of horrible characters. I loved it so much. It's beautifully written, really well done, a really like strong realist collection of short stories, each story being very strong on its own but also working really well alongside each other. I love the way that Rowena MacDonald explores Montreal as a place and explores the various different kind of worlds within it. We get to see a lot of different artists, we get to see a lot of waitresses and a lot of barmen, and we also get a lot of characters in different places of their lives. Like, it's a very diverse collection. We have a lot of characters who are born in Montreal or in different parts of Canada, but also people who are immigrants from Egypt or Iran. We have characters who are in their 20s, who are students. We have a character who's a little girl. We have characters who are kind of older and at different stages in their lives. And I just really like the way that it's full of so many different characters. I think that's done really well. I love this so much. It's absolutely brilliant. My favourite book of the month. I'm sure it will be one of my favourite books of the year, and just one of the best short story collections I've ever read. It was superbly written and brilliantly done, and yes, read this. I very strongly recommend that you read this. Finally, I read a literary magazine. That's this, which is Gold Dust, and this is issue 30. It's quite a mixed bag, as I often do find with literary magazines. They publish both short stories and poetry, and some of it I really enjoy and some of it I'm a bit less sold on, but I think that sometimes happens with literary magazines. And I do think there are some great stories in here and some really enjoyable poetry. So my favourite short story in this issue was Footsteps by Kenneth Hickey, which I thought was just written really beautifully and was really nice and had like a lot of nice touches to it. It was written really well and was a really interesting premise. I was also very, very excited about this issue of Gold Dust because Nick had a poem published in it. If you are new to my channel and don't know, Nick is my boyfriend. He has appeared in quite a few videos before and will appear in many more in the future, and he also writes poetry. His poem Stone Tiger was published in this edition of Gold Dust, and it's one of my favourite poems by him, so I'm going to read that for you. Stone Tiger by Nicholas Rooney. Noor Inayat Khan, 1914 to 1944. They made a statue of me in the gardens where I played. It was polished marble, smooth as silk and just as cold. They made a memorial of me, a monument to their war. They packed me off to Dachu with a radio and a stiff upper lip. They made a stone of me, so now I stare unseeing, a curiosity for passers-by under grey and brooding clouds which cover up the sky. Liberté engraved on my base, the final word I ever said, a silent, pointless affirmation in honour of the dead. They turned a princess into a tiger, and then the tiger into stone, and left her stood in London, in a garden on her own. So those are all of the things that I read in the month of January. Please let me know what you have been reading over the month of January and what your favourite thing was that you read this month. I hope you've all had a good reading month, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.